2023, a year filled with fear and uncertainty for many. While conflicts continue, the global economy stumbles and falters, still trying to get back on its feet. But with hope in mind, the world is seeking solutions and is turning to China. What is China's plan? How do China's numbers match its message?
It's about the insecurity of Europe and America, but it's a misreading of China's emergence.
China has been very open, and by encouraging more people to come to China, visit for themselves, understand.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Despite a sluggish global economy, China has navigated the various economic headwinds with a rather effective policy and has put the economy on solid footing to achieve its full-year growth targets. The International Monetary Fund recently raised its forecast for China's GDP growth this year from 5% in October to 5.4%. Meanwhile, a well-known Western ratings agency cast a negative outlook on China's credit ratings. So what's the true picture of China's economy in 2023? Will the country's 2023 growth targets be reached? And is China's economic growth still crucial for global economic recovery? Join us for today's special year-end discussion from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. We're happy to be joined by David Ma Hong, Executive Chairman, Ma Hong China, and Professor Wang Yaojing, Assistant Professor in Economics at Peking University. Welcome to Dialogue. Use some keywords probably to describe China's economy in 2023.
If you take 2020, 21, and last year, the accrued GDP growth is 20% in China. It's 7.7% in America and 3% in Europe. So there's a momentum that I think we also perhaps shouldn't take for granted. It's a grassroots momentum. It's even something which government policy can't do a great deal about. People are getting back to work. People are actually still investing in their businesses, their brands. So from a grassroots perspective, and I travel a lot in China each week, I see a lot of activity and I see a recovery of confidence commercially. But I still think there's some social insecurity in terms of people are still a bit wounded by what occurred in the last 3 years. But that will pass. I think by the spring of next year, we'll see much more solid growth and far better indicators in the key areas, even in the property sector.
Mm-hmm. What about this year's, 2023, the growth targets? The Chinese government has set the target as around 5%. So do you think the country will reach its target?
I think to reach 5% is very doable. We thought 3 months ago it would have been shy of 5%, perhaps 4.7 or so. But I think the growth is genuine, and the government has done a lot. I mean, it's investing in infrastructure, not bridges to nowhere. It's like rebuilding hospitals in major cities or developing them further. It's going back to improve on existing infrastructure. But this move to technology is very interesting. I mean, Xi Jinping's visit to Shanghai, I think, was very significant. And the signal is that this is not going to replace property, but it is an engine in itself that in the medium term will be a very strong driver of growth in China. So I think when you have a socialist market economy as China does, you can do more things and you can push things further. So the government, I think, is doing some genuine stimulus. So I think China's going to eat a bit more bitterness and will come through this period reasonably well by the time we get into the spring and summer of next year.
Professor Yao, you mentioned that we are seeing new drivers instead of relying on, say, property sector, export, heavy investment. What are the sectors? What are the new sectors that are driving economic growth here?
So let's talk about a few of the industries that China is leading in the world. First of all is the renewable energy, right? I think China is building 80% of the new energy buses around the world, and China is investing all over the world, making those batteries for, like Tesla is taking Chinese batteries now. So that is one, and the other one is digital economy. So we're seeing a lot of the big platforms in the world that are Chinese companies, and it's been viral, like TikTok has been viral to the world and shine. It's very popular in a lot of the countries.
Speaking of this green development, our team went to southern China, Foshan in Guangdong province, to take a close look at the hydrogen economy or hydrogen energy development there. Let's take a quick look. 您开这个车多长时间了，师傅？
开了1年多了。
那你最大的感受和开这个柴油的这种卡车有什么区别呢？
最大感受开的比那个柴油车比较轻松、舒服、舒适啊。实际上开这个电车的话，你那个司机没有那么疲劳。
没那么疲劳。
对对对，
为什么呢？
因为你如果是油车的话呢，可能你要加油，还要减油还要挂档啊什么的忙，所以说我们存在疲劳的话，可能对安全的有
影响
啊。这个是白油的话，就是按说是零排放的了。
排放的水是吧？
对对对，排放出来是水。那个噪音呢是减少了，基本上是没有什么噪音了。
电堆的话呢，是在这个驾驶室的下方，对，跟我们传统的燃油车的位置是一致的。然后的话呢，它相较于传统的燃油车来说，会多了中间这样一个位置。
哦，对了，这个是成那个
车的一个气瓶，就跟我们传统的燃油车来说的话，相当于是气的油箱。 这个电堆对于我们来说是免维护的，对，
反而减少了这个维护的费用。
是的，是的。
So, David, we mentioned about this new energy industry globally. Where is China now, and what does it mean, in terms of economy, in terms of, say, the global efforts in the battle against climate change?
China is the first country to make solar panels viable, and not just viable technically, but the economic story around renewable energy in China is really interesting. In smaller countries, people still struggle to make the use of wind power and to apply it in a way that is industrially supportive. In China, we've gone beyond that. I also think that China's relative isolation technically, while America has tried to block China's rise by using any means it can to prevent its technological evolution, it's forced China into a greater state of independence. And the innovation here is happening more swiftly than it would have otherwise. So we're living in a very interesting time where the very thing that the US and its allies want to prevent China from becoming, it is becoming faster and depends less and less on the West. So this is a very interesting time for China for strategic and political reasons. It needs to be technically innovative. It needs to be more independent in energy. And as a result, it becomes less of a market for those that currently are opposing China. So in the medium term, China's problems are going to make it stronger. So I'm really interested to see what that eventually will do in terms of exporting technology, as we are with electric vehicles, developing battery technology that is now leading the world. So these things, the more China has resistance, the stronger it becomes. And the tech sector is one of the major case studies for that.
Mm-hmm. Professor Yo, in a sense, you do see like this new energy industry globally is somehow is more gravitating toward China. Is that where China is now?
I think policy-wise, I really do like the policies that it's very forward-looking. So what you see right now is actually the result of policies that's been 10 years ago that has been already formed. And we actually, if you remember, a couple of years ago when there's a heavy subsidy into the electric vehicle industry, and some people accused the subsidy to be too heavy, and a lot of the manufacturers, small manufacturers, just crowd in and just trying to take the subsidy. But after a while, you see the winners come out, and you see some of the really good companies, really good manufacturers, they come out. So they are selected from a very intense market, competitive market. So I would believe that if they survive the Chinese market, which is highly, highly competitive, they have an edge in the global market, and they'll continue to do that.
Yeah, the overall economic prospects, let's say, in particular from, say, internationally or the Western perspective, there seems like a bit mixed. For example, first we mentioned about the IMF. They say Chinese economy is going to reach its target of 5.4% for 2023, and they also reaffirmed an October upward version of China's growth projection in 2024 from 4.2% to 4.6%. What do you make of this kind of like optimism, David, here?
I don't think we should concentrate too much on the GDP figure. China's a big country. It is now arguably the biggest economy in the world. By purchasing power, parity it would be. So it's so big that its momentum can be measured in many ways. I think the most important thing is to look at where China is competitive globally and the extent to which China attracts investment internationally, and also where the West perceives China as an important market for their companies. These are the things that are, I think, more important measurements. And what interests me about the Chinese economy is that we're beginning to see, as in the electric vehicle sector, globally competitive companies like BYD. And you've got a business model there that, yes, there was government support in the beginning, but these are truly independent private businesses. So China, I think, needs to look at, why is America powerful? It has Cisco, it has Apple, it has Starbucks, it has Netflix, it has these dominant global players. So when China is really getting into a position of strength, it will have its own version of these things in its specific industries where domestically it's strong. I think for robotics, for AI, definitely within 5 years, China will be in a leading position in many ways. So rather than face what Huawei have faced, I mean, Huawei would be a dominant global company, but it was unjustly prevented, not because of security issues, just because you use politics to compete. And that's unfortunately what took place. So there's a stumbling block, but we'll get past that. So I think we'll begin to see emerging these global brands around new technology. And we're already seeing it in the vehicle sector. So it's almost like the torch ahead of us. The trouble is, I don't think the government policy, I don't think the banking system here is yet sophisticated or flexible enough to allow for these major private businesses to become strong and big enough. So there's some structural changes that need to be made.
Of course, there are seems to be different opinions. For example, the U.S. ratings agency Moody's, they have casted, it provides an outlook on China's economy, rather negative one, on December 5th. So, Professor Yao, what do you make of this different estimation in terms of Chinese economy here?
What they actually did in 2017 is that they downgraded China's sovereign bond rating. And did that do anything to Chinese economy? I have not seen any. So this is what they do for, I don't know, for gesturing like their political views or whatever. But the fact is that it's like they are lowering someone's credit card limit while someone does not borrow that on that credit card. Because most of our sovereign bonds are internal, they're in RMB, and their rating is more for investors who are looking to buy our sovereign bond, which is not really sold globally, not in the US currency. So it is possibly misunderstanding or some kind of political issues that it would only hurt their own credibility rather than the Chinese economy.
Economic performance, besides these domestic factors, one is, I would say people won't ignore, that is the politics, let's say China-US relationship or the US pressure on the Chinese side. Long Yong-chu, Mr. Long is the chief negotiator for China's admission to the WTO many years ago. he had an interview saying that basically like the two countries should cooperate. Let's take a listen here.
A few months ago, I spoke to some foreign business leaders, basically from the United States. I told them, if you treat us like this 20 or 30 years ago, we are finished. But now it's too late for you to do that. Because during the last 2 or 3 decades, China's size of economy grew so fast. So the size of the economy, the size of the population, the size of the middle class group, the size of a Chinese manufacturer, which is bigger than those of United States, Germany, Japan, Korea get together. All we have such a big size of manufacturing, taking 30%, over 30% of the whole size of the world manufacturing sectors. And also through the globalization, China's economy through the supply chain and the manufacturing chain has been deeply integrated with one another. It's not easily to cut off of this manufacturing and supply chain. So the size of the Chinese economy has decided that you cannot easily get away from China. You cannot. And also, we hope to tell the United States that if you cannot beat us to death, if you cannot throw out easily, it better consider whether it's good for you to cooperate with us. I think that would be better for them. It is their basic interest. We hope they change their mind.
Mr. Long said that U.S. will not be able to beat China, and the wise way for Washington is to cooperate with China. Do you agree, David?
I think he's right. I mean, look at the last 40 years. It has been the American-China collaboration that's made the whole world wealthier, more stable, lifted more people out of poverty than any time in history, not just in China, but across the world. So he's right. I think we're looking at a tide of history where the West is beginning to decline, and the West, therefore, is becoming insecure about its own decline. And they're looking for somewhere to blame, and they see China's development. So they'd rather point to China's development as a cause for their own internal decline and lay on sanctions and bring up all these geopolitical tensions, which is what America is doing a lot in Asia, which is really not about China at all, or about any real conflict. It's about the insecurity of Europe and America facing this phase, this period of decline. And all empires fail. All countries become strong, and then they become weak again. And the trouble with our lot in the West, we're struggling with that. We don't want to accept it. We can't adapt to the fact we're losing power. And so we're worried about the emergence of China. But it's a misreading of China's emergence, because China is not the replacement empire. China is just becoming strong, and it's 20% of the world's population. So I think gradually European countries and other countries around the world will realize that the best thing is to cooperate with China. China will need to be flexible, patient, not react, and just have confidence in its own evolution.
Mm-hmm. Professor Yeo, just as Mr. Long and David has mentioned about the best way in terms of their own interests and also the interests of the world is for Washington and Beijing to cooperate with each other instead of pursuing the so-called decoupling policy, separating, cutting off relationship between the two countries.
I think what they call decoupling or de-risking is the same thing. It's just that decoupling sounds too harsh, and then they used a different word and make it look better, but it's actually not. So so this de-risking or decoupling thing is, I see more like a political campaign to make a gesture to their voters or whoever. But really is that if you think about what businesses and what people want is to cooperate. It's only by cooperating and coordinating with China, and working with China, could the that Western, whether it's US or European businesses and people would benefit from that. So it's at the end of the day, politicians, they really do care about just their own political views or political goals instead of what the businesses and the people want. They can talk about decoupling and de-risking all the time, but if they do care about what the businesses and people's benefits, they should be cooperating.
Well, I also talked to Yukang Huang, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In the interview, he points out an interesting story, basically. Let's take a listen first.
China's growth of 7, 8, 9% over the last decade and a half increased global growth by a full 1 to 2 percentage points a year, especially for developing countries. So that's been a very positive effect. It also actually uplifted the growth rate of Europe. People don't actually recognize that, but it did. So a shrinking or a slow growth in China is bad for China, but bad for the world. And there have been some simulations about the consequences of the technology war, the trade war. This potentially continues. More restrictions, more tariffs. It could slow down China's annual growth rate, let's say a full percentage point. And you begin to feel that actually in what's going on in China. But many people in the West don't realize that there's also a negative impact upon US and European companies. If US European companies cannot and will not export high-tech products to China, then these companies don't have the revenues to support the research and development. Innovation in the West slows down. So there have been some studies which have shown that in a technology war, a policy of de-risking will also lower growth rates in the West by as much as 1% a year, let's say 5 to 10 years down the line. Now, if you think about it, the West considers a steady growth of around 2% or 2.5% as a good solid achievement on an annual basis. But if that growth rate is cut by a full percentage point, and growth in Europe and the United States is only 1%, not 2%, that actually has some very serious consequences for the U.S. So a de-risking strategy has negative implications for China, I would say in the near term, but in the medium term, it has serious negative implications for the West. No one comes out of this better.
So, David, where are we now in the pursuit of decoupling or de-risking, from Washington, from Brussels?
It's all very well in Brussels and Washington to talk about decoupling. This is a political discussion. But the history of the American economy is not that they obey some ideology. They trade. I mean, American companies are global thinkers. They have dominance in so many sectors because they will go where the returns are. And going forward, China will be the economy where the returns are. So people will come and invest here. Is decoupling a reality? Look at the American companies in China. Are they leaving? They're not leaving. They're actually expanding here. So I don't think it's a real thing. I think it's a political wish. I think it's something for politicians to focus on to give the appearance of action in a situation where the world is struggling, particularly the Western world. So I have every confidence that whether it's European companies or American companies, they will come and do business here because this is where the consumers are and these are where the returns are. So I'm not too concerned about rhetoric on decoupling. Mm-hmm. And Yukang Huang has made interesting comments in the last 12 months. And I think, by the way, he's one of the most accurate assessors of China. He's a contrarian in many ways, and he's largely right. And he's talked about if America and Europe really concentrate on this blocking of technology, it could cost China even 1% of GDP growth. And that is serious. But that would be temporary. It might last for 3, 4, even 5 years. But China will still grow. And what's happening within that is that, okay, those things that China's not getting from the West, the investments that aren't coming, the businesses that can't bring their technology to China, China then becomes more and more independent. So in the end, those businesses lose a great deal. So it won't last, but at the top end, microchips, high-speed computers, these areas, or anything related to defense, America will be quite stubborn in that field. And that will have an impact, but not so much that it will prevent China's growth. It'll just shave a bit off its annual GDP development.
Well, speaking of the China market, of course, Professor Yo, there are challenges, obviously, in the real estate sector. We are talking about, the somewhat lukewarm confidence in the private sector, investment, consumption here. The government has taken some measures, but how effective are these measures, and where we are now, and what we are expecting?
Let's take the real estate market, for example. So I think the central government released policy on boosting the demand for its, say, supply chain. So the government is providing a lot of the housing for the essential housing needs. So I think the demand side, the government is trying to do that. And for the supply side, they will have to restructure a lot of the debt from the real estate companies. And they will have to work together with the local government, with the banks, and to make sure that no systematic risks would happen. So that's a property market. But we will have to wait for some time to see the results. But a stable property market is probably what we are working towards for the next year.
For the next year. And also, of course, in December, we have this Central Economic Conference, which is an important one. Usually it sets basically the tone of economic policy making for the next year. So what's the signal, David? People say it seems like there's a refocus of a single focus on the economic growth for 2024. Probably we are going to see more policies to support economic growth here.
I hope we see policies that encourage the private sector. I hope we see initiatives that allow for the creation of a more stable private banking sector, because the state controls the banking system, which is why we don't have recessions, which is why we don't have crises. So it's a good thing, but it doesn't help growth in the way we now need.
There's two sides.
It's got two sides. So we need a much more efficient and more flexible private banking system. And in the absence of it, we end up with these shadow banking structures and these informal structures, which are inherently very unstable. So I hope to hear initiatives that the private sector can get better credit policies out of a non-state banking system. That'd be a major move. If that came as a message, that would also encourage foreign investors. It would encourage people who are looking at China's capital markets. So I think the messages can be very simple. I'm not sure if the government's ready yet. I think they're still struggling with trying to see how they manage all these problems at once. And how they balance the fact that the property crisis is in the third and fourth tier cities. They were the ones that overbuilt. They speculated. They converted land into projects because they needed the income. Whereas the major cities, the 11 coastal provinces and the major cities of China, that property sector's fine. That'll be fine by next year. The demand will come back. People want to live in these places. So we're getting a sort of hangover of an overemphasis in the property sector. We need to go through this. And once we come out of it, property won't be such a strong driver of the Chinese economy, but it will be a healthy sector. And it will come back as a bringing demand for all the things, whether it's construction materials or appliances, all the things that property is the catalyst for in an economy. So we'll get through this. But I think we have to be careful we don't over-focus on what's happening to property. It's a kind of partly a sickness we have to allow the economy to go through. Let's look, as you were mentioning earlier, focus on the tech sector, focus on the newer areas of the Chinese economy, which are the future.
Thank you, Yao-Jing. Thank you, David. With that, we come to the end for today's special discussion on Chinese economy. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.